I've always loved road trips. There's something about the freedom of the open road, the way you can just put on some music, drive for hours, and feel a little bit of the weight of life lifted off your shoulders. That's why, when my best friend Jake and I decided to take a road trip up the East Coast last fall, I couldn't have been more excited. We'd planned a route that would take us from Florida to Maine, hitting all the best coastal towns and hidden gems along the way. It was supposed to be a perfect adventure, just the two of us and the winding road. On the fourth night of our trip, we ended up near Cherry Hill, New Jersey. We'd planned on making it further north by then, but a massive thunderstorm slowed us down. By the time we reached the outskirts of Cherry Hill, the rain was coming down in sheets, so thick you could barely see a few feet ahead of the car. The roads were nearly empty, and the world outside was dark, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the deserted highway. Jake and I agreed it was best to find a place to stay for the night. Neither of us had been to Cherry Hill before, but a quick search on my phone showed a small family-owned inn just off the main road. It looked old and slightly run down in the photos, but it had rooms available, and that was all we cared about at that point. The drive to the inn felt surreal. The GPS led us down narrow, winding roads bordered by dense trees. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the sound of thunder echoed in the distance. Every few minutes, lightning would flash, illuminating the trees and the shadows that stretched across the road. The inn finally appeared out of nowhere, a large Victorian-style building with dark, peeling paint and a faded sign that read, Cherry Hill Lodge. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting a weak yellowish glow over the empty parking lot. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, eyeing the building warily. "It's just for one night," I replied, though I had to admit, the place gave me an uneasy feeling. We grabbed our bags and dashed through the rain to the front door. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with old-fashioned wallpaper and a dusty chandelier hanging from the ceiling. An elderly woman sat behind the check-in counter, her grey hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked up as we entered, her eyes narrowing as if she wasn't used to seeing new faces. "Room for two?" she asked in a raspy voice, her gaze lingering on us a little too long. "Yes, please," Jake replied, glancing at me with a nervous smile. She handed us an old-fashioned key attached to a large wooden tag with the number 3 engraved on it. "Second floor, end of the hall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be sure to lock the door and try to stay quiet after midnight." Jake and I exchanged a look, but we didn't ask any questions. We thanked her, took the key, and made our way up the creaky wooden staircase to our room. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with faded portraits of people who looked like they'd lived a century ago. The carpet was worn, and every step we took seemed to echo in the silence. Our room was small and musty, with a single bed and an old wooden dresser. The rain outside had picked up again, and the sound of it pounding against the windows filled the room. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I unpacked my things, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to the storm and the strangeness of the old inn. After a quick, cold dinner from a nearby fast food place, Jake and I settled in, each of us claiming a side of the bed. We tried to relax, watching a movie on Jake's laptop, but something about the room felt wrong. The shadows seemed to move with every flash of lightning, and the air felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on us. Around midnight, just as we were starting to drift off, we heard a faint noise outside our door. It was subtle at first, like the creak of a floorboard or the whisper of fabric brushing against the wall. Jake and I sat up, exchanging nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I nodded, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, turning into the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway. My heart pounded as I realized that whoever was out there was stopping at each door, pausing briefly before moving on to the next one. The footsteps grew closer until they stopped right outside our door. Jake and I held our breath, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. After a few tense seconds, the doorknob rattled, as if someone was testing it, trying to see if it would open. Jake grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Should we say something?" he whispered. I shook my head, not wanting to draw attention. We stayed silent, listening as the person outside lingered, their presence heavy and menacing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, fading down the hallway. We waited a few minutes before daring to breathe again. I looked at Jake, who was as pale as I felt. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I don't think we're alone here." We barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. When morning finally came, we packed our bags and hurried downstairs, eager to leave the inn behind. The elderly woman was at the counter again, watching us with a strange expression as we handed her the key. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice laced with something that sounded almost like amusement. I hesitated, glancing at Jake before replying. "Not exactly. There was someone walking around the hallway last night." The woman's smile faded, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something, fear, sadness, in her eyes. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "That would have been him," she said, almost in a whisper. "He's been here a long time, watching over the place. He doesn't like strangers." Jake and I exchanged a horrified glance, realizing that whatever had been outside our door wasn't just a guest or a prankster. We thanked her and left as quickly as we could, not daring to look back. As we drove away, the rain finally stopped, and the clouds began to part, letting the first rays of sunlight break through. But even with the warmth of the sun on my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something dark and dangerous. To this day, I still don't know who or what was outside our door that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out. Back in 2018, I took a solo trip across the southwestern US, a journey I'd been dreaming of for years. My route took me from Denver, Colorado, all the way to Phoenix, Arizona, down long, open roads that cut through desert and mountains. It was autumn, and the days were warm while the nights grew crisp and cool. I had planned most of my stops, but left room for spontaneity, figuring I'd take in the scenery and the small towns along the way. By the time I reached Moab, Utah, I was exhausted from driving, so I decided to spend a couple of nights there to recharge. Moab is a beautiful place, surrounded by the red rock wonders of Arches and Canyonlands national parks, and I spent the days hiking, exploring, and soaking up the quiet beauty of the landscape. But on my second night in Moab, something happened that's haunted me ever since. I was staying at a small inn just off Main Street, with a view of the cliffs in the distance. That night a storm rolled in, sudden and fierce, with dark clouds stretching over the desert, thunder rumbling across the sky, and lightning flashing against the cliffs. I'd planned on going to bed early, but something about the storm made me restless. Around midnight I found myself wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to get out, to drive. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my keys, pulled on a jacket, and headed out into the rain. The streets of Moab were empty, and I drove out to Highway 191, figuring I'd just drive a bit to clear my head. The rain poured down, filling the desert air with the scent of wet earth, and I could barely see a few feet ahead as my headlights cut through the downpour. About 10 miles south of town, I saw someone standing on the side of the road. It was a man, his clothes soaked through, holding his arm up as if signaling for help. I slowed down, squinting through the rain to get a better look. He looked like he'd been out in the storm for a while, tall, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a worn jacket hanging off his shoulders. I'd always heard it wasn't safe to pick up hitchhikers, but something about the way he stood there, alone in the rain, struck a chord with me. I pulled over, and he quickly made his way to the passenger door, climbing in without a word. He didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead as he buckled his seatbelt. "You okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Looks like you got caught in the storm." He nodded slowly, his face barely visible in the dim light of the car. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and calm. I was starting to think no one would. I couldn't tell how old he was. He looked somewhere in his 30s maybe, but there was something ageless about his expression, like he'd been through things most people couldn't imagine. I told him I'd drive him back to Moab, figuring he was just some traveler who'd lost his way. He didn't argue, didn't give any details, just sat there in silence as we drove back up the rain-soaked highway. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing over, trying to get a read on him. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road as if he was somewhere far away. The rain hammered against the windshield, and I had to focus on the road to keep the car steady. Eventually, I decided to try and get him talking. "So, what were you doing out there?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He paused, as if he hadn't expected the question. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I've been on the road a long time." I nodded, not wanting to push him, but something about his tone gave me chills. It wasn't just that he sounded tired. It was more like he was weighed down by something, a heaviness that hung in the air between us. We were about 5 miles from town when he finally turned to look at me. His eyes were dark, intense, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "You shouldn't be out here tonight," he said, his voice low and serious. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Tell me about it." I guess I just couldn't sleep. He didn't smile. "It's not safe," he said, his eyes fixed on me. "There are things out here, things people aren't meant to see." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just focused on the road, telling myself he was probably just tired or maybe even a bit unhinged from the isolation of the desert. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a small, weathered photograph. He handed it to me without a word. In the dim light of the dashboard, I could just make out the image, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, standing in a field of wildflowers. Her smile was warm and genuine, the kind that lights up a room, and she held a bouquet of flowers in her hands. "She was my wife," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I lost her out here, on a night like this." I didn't know what to say. I handed the photograph back, feeling a strange sense of sadness and dread settling over me. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow. He nodded, tucking the photo back into his pocket. "We were driving through the desert, a night just like this. The storm came out of nowhere, and we pulled over to wait it out. But then, something happened." He trailed off, staring out the window, his face pale and haunted. "She got out of the car," he continued after a long pause. "Said she saw someone standing in the rain. She thought they needed help. I tried to stop her, told her not to go, but she didn't listen." He clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "She walked into the storm, and I waited for her to come back. But she never did. I searched for hours, called her name over and over. But she was gone." A chill ran through me, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I didn't know what to make of his story, didn't know if I even believed it, but the raw emotion in his voice was undeniable. We drove in silence for a while, the rain pounding against the car, the sound almost deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something lurking just beyond the edges of the headlights. When we finally reached Moab, I pulled up to the edge of town, near a gas station, and stopped. "This is as far as I can take you," I said, my voice barely steady. He nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and reaching for the door. But before he got out, he turned to me one last time, his gaze piercing. If you ever see her out there, if you see someone standing in the rain, don't stop. Just keep driving." With that, he climbed out, disappearing into the darkness and rain. I watched him go, a shiver running down my spine. I waited a few moments, trying to process everything he'd told me before finally pulling away and driving back to my inn. The next morning, I asked around town, describing the man I'd picked up, hoping someone might know him, might know if his story was true. But no one seemed to know who he was. Some people looked at me strangely, and one old man shook his head, telling me there'd been stories of a woman disappearing in the desert years ago, a hitchhiker who vanished without a trace. I left Moab that day, feeling haunted by the memory of the man in the rain and the sorrow in his eyes. And now, whenever I drive through a storm at night, I can't help but look out into the darkness, half expecting to see someone standing there waiting. And every time I remember his words, "If you see her, don't stop." In the summer of 2019, I took a solo trip to Maine, looking for a quiet place to spend a few weeks working on my art and getting away from the bustle of city life. Maine's coast is beautiful, rugged, and lined with ancient pine forests and rocky shores where waves crash against cliffs in a constant calming rhythm. I rented a small cabin near Pemaquid Point, right by the famous Pemaquid Lighthouse. The area was serene, almost hauntingly beautiful, especially when fog rolled in and blanketed the coastline. The locals had warned me that coastal storms could be fierce that time of year, but I was prepared. My cabin was cozy, with sturdy walls and a fireplace, and I had enough supplies to last me through a few rough days. The only downside was the lack of cell service, but I could drive a few miles inland and get a signal if I needed to. On my second night there, a massive storm swept in from the Atlantic. The sky darkened long before sunset, and a steady drizzle began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the lighthouse's beam cut through the fog, a comforting presence in the darkening sky. I watched from my cabin window as the rain beat down on the trees and the waves crashed against the rocks, feeling a strange mix of peace and anticipation. Around midnight, as the storm intensified, I settled into bed with a book, listening to the rain pounding against the roof. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat, a faint, insistent knock at the front door. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the knock came again, louder this time, cutting through the sound of the storm. I hesitated, then got out of bed, grabbing my flashlight and heading to the door. When I opened it, I saw a man standing on the porch, drenched from head to toe. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and greying hair plastered to his forehead. His clothes were soaked, and he looked like he'd been out in the rain for hours. Despite the downpour, he seemed calm, almost at ease, standing there in the dark. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice rough but polite. "I'm the lighthouse keeper. My name's Tom. I just came to check on the cabins, make sure everyone's all right. The storm's worse than we expected." I felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Thanks for checking in," I replied, stepping back to let him out of the rain. "Would you like to come in for a bit?" He shook his head, glancing back toward the lighthouse. "No, I need to get back soon, but I wanted to make sure you knew about the evacuation route. Sometimes these storms knock out the power, and it's easy to get turned around in the dark." He handed me a small water-stained map of the area, with a path marked from the cabins to a nearby emergency shelter. I thanked him, feeling reassured by his presence. We exchanged a few pleasantries about the storm, and then he tipped his hat and turned back toward the lighthouse. I watched him disappear into the rain, the beam from the lighthouse sweeping over him every few seconds as he made his way back. There was something timeless about him, something that felt out of place in the modern world, but I shrugged it off and went back inside. The storm raged on through the night, and at some point, the power went out. I lit a few candles, and settled back into bed, the map Tom had given me resting on the nightstand. I fell asleep to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, feeling oddly comforted by the lighthouse's steady rhythm. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving a thick layer of mist hanging over the coastline. The power was still out, so I decided to walk over to the lighthouse to thank Tom again for checking on me. As I made my way along the narrow, winding path to the lighthouse, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. The only sound was the distant cry of gulls and the faint lapping of waves against the rocks. When I reached the lighthouse, I found a small door at the base and knocked, expecting Tom to answer, but there was no response. I knocked again, then tried the door. It was unlocked, so I stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the scent of salt and old wood. I climbed the narrow staircase that spiraled up to the top, calling out Tom's name as I went. But the lighthouse was empty. When I reached the top, I found only the massive, silent lamp, its glass reflecting the grey light filtering through the mist. Confused, I made my way back down and decided to head into town to see if anyone knew where Tom might be. I stopped by a small cafe near the waterfront, where an older woman was tending the counter. I struck up a conversation and casually mentioned meeting the lighthouse keeper Tom during the storm. The woman's face went pale, and she set down the mug she was holding, staring at me in shock. "Tom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean Tom Parker?" I nodded, taken aback by her reaction. "Yes, he said he was checking on the cabins during the storm, gave me a map of the evacuation route." She shook her head slowly, her eyes filling with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Tom Parker died 5 years ago," she said, her voice trembling. "He was the lighthouse keeper here for over 30 years, drowned in a storm just like the one last night. He went out to check on a stranded boater, but his boat capsized in the waves. They never found his body." A chill ran down my spine as I processed her words. I tried to protest, to explain that I'd seen him, spoken to him, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. I pulled out the map he'd given me, showing it to her. Her hand flew to her mouth as she recognized it, a map that had been issued to the lighthouse staff years ago, long before Tom's death. Shaken, I left the cafe and made my way back to the cabin, the weight of the encounter settling over me like a dark cloud. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the sound of the waves, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept thinking about Tom, about the way he'd looked at the lighthouse, as if drawn back to it even in death. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin, unable to spend another night there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the lighthouse one last time, watching as the beams swept over the empty shoreline. I never returned to Pemaquid Point, but I still think about that night, about the storm, and about the man who came to my door long after he should have been gone.